She sat cross-legged in the shade of a mesquite tree, watching the smoke curl from the grill like a warning signal. Every day for 2 weeks, she'd been offered the same thing: slow-cooked Texas barbecue, pork ribs glazed in sauce, heaped beside beans and cornbread. And every day she turned her face away. She never said why, never asked for anything else. The Cowboys joked at first. "Must be too spicy for her," one said. Another quipped, "Bet she misses rice." But the laughter faded when a young ranch hand, curious and kind, sat beside her one afternoon and asked, gently, why. She didn't speak at first. Then, in broken English, she said 4 words that made the air go still. "My father was pig farmer." And with that, a silence heavier than smoke settled over the camp. Because what followed wasn't about food, it was about memory, war, and what a daughter chooses to remember. The day after she said those 4 words, the mess line moved slower. Not because there were fewer hands, but because something invisible had settled in the dust. The Cowboys, usually loud in the mornings, trading jabs over grill heat, laughing at the way bacon crackled like gunfire, were quiet now. Their boots still scuffed the dirt, their hats still tipped back in the sun, but their eyes flicked more often toward the far end of the line where Midori always stood. Not near the front, not at the very back, just apart. She wasn't unfriendly. She bowed when spoken to. She nodded when handed her tray. She swept the barn floors with the rest of the girls, fed chickens when asked, and never complained. But there was a stillness to her that unsettled the men, as if she existed just half a step outside the camp's rhythm. While the other Japanese women whispered softly in groups, practiced English with giggles and mistakes, or tried peanut butter with theatrical grimaces, Midori kept to herself. She wasn't aloof, just quiet. Her eyes gave nothing away. Not in the early morning when the air was still cool, not in the heat of midday when sweat pooled at her collarbones, and not in the evenings when harmonica songs drifted from bunkhouses like lullabies with no lyrics. She didn't avoid people, but she didn't seek them either. She was present the way a shadow is present, defined only by what it doesn't say. It was the barbecue that brought her into focus. Every evening around sunset, the Cowboys fired up the long iron smoker outside the main mess tent. The smell was impossible to ignore, thick, rich, and sweet with molasses. Pork ribs, brisket, sometimes sausage. It was a ritual, part necessity, part theater. The POWs, weary from chores, lined up with trays, the scent of meat stirring some long-dormant memory of abundance. Most accepted their portions with hesitation at first, cultural, moral, emotional hesitations, but hunger and time dulled those edges, except for Midori. 14 days. That's how long she'd quietly refused. She never made a scene. She didn't wrinkle her nose or shove her tray back. She simply offered a small bow, declined the meat, and moved on with whatever was offered instead. Beans, bread, sometimes a small tin of peaches. At first, it was written off as pickiness. Then the guards figured it was religion. One older cowboy shrugged. "Maybe she just don't like pork." Another chuckled. "Maybe it reminds her of us." Laughter followed, but it didn't last. The curiosity grew in silence. Every night, someone noticed. And slowly, it stopped being funny. There was something about the way she stood near the smoke, eyes just slightly lowered, hands folded over her tray like she was holding a folded flag. The kind of quiet that demanded listening. It was Luke who finally asked. The youngest of the guards, not long out of high school. He'd been the one to offer extra sugar cubes to the girls and bring harmonica tunes to the barn when nights ran long. He wasn't trying to pry, just sitting in the dirt, tired, looking for company. She was under the mesquite tree again, her plate half finished. He sat beside her, not too close. Said nothing for a while, just watched the sky burn orange. Then, with the kind of voice you use with animals in grief, he asked, "You don't like barbecue?" She looked at him. Really looked. Her eyes were darker than he expected. Not black, but deep brown, holding something far older than she looked. She didn't answer right away. He almost took the question back. But then she spoke, carefully, in English that wobbled like a wire under strain. "My father was pig farmer." That was all. But the way she said it, the way the words landed, not as a joke, not with shame, just as fact, made something shift in the air around them. Luke blinked. He looked at her hands, how they were still folded. Then at her plate, untouched meat removed and set, aside with gentle precision, then back at her face. "I didn't know," he said, because what else was there to say? She didn't nod, didn't need to. The wind rustled the dry grass. Somewhere behind them laughter rose from the mess tent, but it sounded far away now. Luke sat a little longer, hat in his lap, and when he stood to leave, he left her plate untouched. The next day, the fire still burned, the meat still smoked. But something had changed, because now the men knew, and knowing changed everything. Long before Texas, before the war, before smoke ever curled from a grill she would refuse, Midori's world smelled of something else: wet earth, rice straw, and the musky sweetness of pigs in the early morning. Her family lived in a small village on the southern coast of Miyazaki Prefecture, nestled between cedar groves and terraced fields that shimmered green in the spring. The house was modest, wooden beams, sliding paper doors, a garden out back with plums that bloomed in April. But to Midori it was a kingdom, and the heart of it was her father's pig pen. The pigs were enormous to her as a child, great grunting beasts that rolled in mud and barked with excitement when she approached. But they were never dirty to her. She saw them the way her father did, intelligent, gentle, noble in their own peculiar way. Every morning, before school, she'd follow him to the pen, trailing a bucket half her size. She would help scatter the feed, scraps, barley mash, fermented grains. Her favorite was a sow with a crooked ear whom she named Yuki, though her father insisted not to name animals meant for sale. Still, she whispered it anyway. He taught her how to brush their flanks, how to speak softly so they wouldn't spook, how to recognize the signs of illness before a vet was needed. "A farmer listens first," he would say, placing her hand gently on a pig's belly as it breathed, "even to those who can't speak." She believed he could understand animals. He never raised his voice, never struck them, even when they were stubborn. She saw the way he looked at them, not as livestock, but as responsibility, as trust. Pigs, in their town, were more than meat. They were livelihood, tradition, even a kind of legacy. In rural Japan, where rice was worshipped and silence respected, pigs were different, loud, demanding, and yet they were revered, not in shrines, but in kitchens and ledgers. To raise pigs well was to be a man of reliability. To sell them fairly was to be known. Midori's father was both. Neighbors came to him for advice. He wore the same patched jacket every day, but when he walked through the market with a squealing piglet under each arm, he walked tall. Then the war came, first with whispers, then with marches, and finally with lists. Rationing began slowly: sugar, rice, soy sauce. Midori remembered the day her school lunch changed. Fish was replaced by daikon, rice by millet. But at home her father still fed the pigs. still worked the pens at sunrise. "We will endure," he said, as if stubbornness alone could outlast the hunger. But then the army arrived. Uniformed men, knocked with paperwork and politeness so sharp it cut. The government had requisitioned all livestock in the region for military use. For the troops, they said, for the emperor. Her father nodded. What else could he do? The next week, trucks came, and with them, the silence that never left. They took all but one pig, a runt, unfit for slaughter. Her father didn't argue, didn't cry. He just stood by the gate, hands clenched at his sides, as the soldiers hoisted squealing animals into crates. Midori watched from behind the house, fists pressed to her mouth, silent like she'd been taught. That night, the pens were empty. Her father sat outside on a wooden stool, staring at the moon. He didn't eat, didn't speak. The next morning he was out before sunrise, raking straw that no longer had purpose. From that day on, he never raised another pig. Midori still fed the runt. She named it anyway, Ume, after the plum trees. She wasn't supposed to, but the rules felt thin now, like paper left in rain. Her father watched her brush the piglet's back one morning and said only, "She won't be taken, not while I'm alive." His voice had lost its weight, but those words still held. Months passed. Bombs fell in cities she'd only seen on maps. Her brother left for the army. Letters stopped coming. And then one day, a recruiter came for her, not with force, but with purpose. Japan needed women, not just nurses or wives, but assistants, helpers, teishintai, a patriotic duty, they called it. Her mother wept silently. Her father nodded once. He gave her a wrapped package, pickled plum rice balls, and a photograph of them standing by the pig pen. She never told him goodbye. She couldn't, because even then she believed she would return, that the world would make sense again, that if she could serve with honor, she could walk back down that hill, barefoot, and find Yuki or Ume waiting. But the pigs were gone, and soon so was everything else. They gave her a uniform that didn't fit, a canvas satchel that smelled of mold, and a set of instructions she memorized like a hymn. Midori became one of thousands of teishintai, volunteer assistants pulled from classrooms and kitchens to serve the empire. She was only 16, but in the dim barracks where they trained, age meant little. Obedience was everything. Each morning began with shouting. Not insults, just commands barked so sharply they echoed in her bones. They drilled without weapons, but the discipline was no less brutal. Push-ups in the rain, memorization of logistics codes, folding and refolding sheets until corners aligned with military precision. Midori said nothing, complained about nothing, asked for nothing. The instructors praised that. "Still water runs deep," one officer muttered approvingly when she passed inspection with a perfect salute. She stood straighter after that, even as the cold crept into her lungs. The other girls were like her, quiet, thin, trying not to blink too much. At night, they whispered about their families, about boys, about rumors. One said her cousin had vanished after speaking out against the war. Another claimed her older sister had been sent to work in a weapons factory and never came back. But when the sergeants walked by, those whispers died like snuffed candles. Their job wasn't to fight. It was to keep the machine running. Midori was assigned to a transport hub just outside Fukuoka, where trucks rattled through day and night. She logged inventory, counted boxes of bandages and morphine, sorted stacks of rations that grew smaller each month. Her hands learned the weight of canned rice, the feel of wet paper records, the smell of iodine and stale uniforms. She never touched a weapon, but she saw what war did. Men with sunken eyes, shoulders slumped like wilted flags, crates marked urgent that were already soaked in blood. She asked no questions. That was safer. The propaganda was constant. Loudspeakers blared speeches about honor, sacrifice, purity. The Americans were demons, they said, cowards with fat bellies and no soul. Surrender was death with humiliation, not peace. If they took you alive, they would feed you to dogs, strip you in public, brand your skin with shame. That was the story told between drills, between posters, between every word left unspoken. It was fed to them like rations, every day, until it became belief. Midori believed. So when the surrender came, it didn't feel like silence. It felt like betrayal. There was no explosion, no ceremony, just a message relayed down the line. The Emperor has spoken. And with those words, the world shifted. Orders stopped coming. Trucks didn't arrive. Midori watched her superior, a stern woman with ironed sleeves and an always tight bun, sit on a crate and stare into nothing. Some of the girls wept. Others just stood, unmoving, waiting for instructions that never came. Within a week, American soldiers entered the depot. Midori expected to die. They didn't yell, didn't spit. They asked them to pack. She did, shaking so hard her satchel buckle wouldn't close. She was transported to a harbor. Nagasaki, maybe? She couldn't remember. Everything blurred after that. The boat that took them was gray and massive, its deck baking under the sun. She kept her head down. She waited for the blow, for the chain, for the punishment. It never came. On board she was fed. Real food, soft bread, eggs, fruit. She refused at first. She was sure it was a trick. Others ate. Some cried. One girl whispered, "They're fattening us before the torture." Midori believed her. When the ship arrived in America, she didn't know it, only that the air smelled strange, drier, cleaner. She was herded off with the others, past soldiers who barely looked at them. Her shoes were worn through. Her dress hung from her shoulders. She stared at the dirt under her feet and thought, "This is the place where I die." But then something happened. A cowboy took off his hat, not in mockery, not in ceremony, just respect. A small nod as if to say, "I see you." She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the sky. It was the same blue as home, but nothing else felt familiar. The land rolled out flat and endless, dotted with cattle, fences, and barns that looked too clean to be real. The sun was a different kind of brutal here, closer, maybe, more intimate. Midori stepped off the truck and into a place she didn't understand. A Texas cattle ranch, a prisoner of war site disguised as farmland, barbed wire wrapped around pastures, but no towers loomed, no dogs barked. Instead, she was met with the smell of hay, manure, and something smoky hanging low in the air, sweet, greasy, and sharp. It clung to her skin before she even saw the source. A man in a wide-brimmed hat waved her forward. He wore a badge. Not military, exactly, but something close. His shirt was tucked in too tightly, his boots caked in dust. He smiled as he pointed toward the barn where she and the other women would sleep. It wasn't the smile of victory. It was something stranger. Polite discomfort. Like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be doing this. Midori bowed without thinking. No one returned it. She followed the line of women into the barn. It smelled of straw and animal heat, but it was clean. Too clean. Each cot had a folded blanket. Wool. Real. She touched it and flinched. Not from pain, but from memory. The last time she'd had a blanket of her own was before the air raids started. Before the winter they burned furniture to stay warm. The Cowboys handed out soap, toothbrushes, metal trays. One woman stared at hers like it was treasure. Another whispered that this must be a trick. Midori said nothing. She sat on the edge of her cot, shoes still on, hands still in her lap, heart hammering like a fist against a locked door. Her eyes scanned the walls, the rafters, the exits. There were no chains, no shouting, no hands dragging her into some dark place. Just quiet. Cows lowed in the distance. A harmonica played somewhere near the mess hall, off-key and haunting, and then the smell hit her again. Pork fat, charred, sweet with some kind of sauce. It came in, waves, riding the wind like smoke from a village burning. It clawed down her throat, heavy and hot. She stood slowly, like she might collapse, and walked outside. There, by a long iron pit, cowboys in aprons flipped racks of ribs with wide spatulas. Meat hissed and popped. One of them laughed, slapping another on the back. Steam rose in halos around their hats. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. Barbecue! It wasn't a word she knew, but the smell didn't need translation. It was pork. It was flesh. It was the ghost of her father's farm. Her hands clenched. The back of her throat stung. She watched a slab of ribs hit the grill and spit fire. The sound was too close to artillery, the smell too close to memory. A guard saw her watching and raised a hand. "Supper's almost ready," he called gently, as if that were comfort, as if that explained anything. She turned away, walked back to the barn, sat on her cot, and buried her face in her hands. Other women trickled in as the sun dropped. Some chatted softly, speaking in half-formed English, half-remembered Japanese. Midori stayed silent. When the call for dinner came, she followed the line, not because she wanted to eat, but because standing still would draw attention. They handed her a tray, beans, bread, a slice of peach, and 2 ribs, thick with sauce. She stared at them like they were weapons. She took the tray, bowed, walked to the end of the bench, and without drama, without word, she removed the ribs and placed them neatly to the side. Then she picked up her fork and began to eat, slowly, quietly. With every bite her hands shook. The sweetness of the peach was too bright, the bread too soft, the air too filled with laughter. Behind her someone strummed a banjo. She felt the war hadn't ended. It had just changed shape, shifted into something harder to name. Because in this strange, quiet place with no beatings, no cruelty, and too much food, the hardest thing to survive was not hunger. It was memory, and the smell of pigs roasting in the wind. Midori folded her blanket every morning the same way her mother had folded futons, tight corners, no wrinkles, always toward the door. She washed her hands before meals even if no one else did. She waited until the mess hall was nearly empty before she stepped inside. And when she sat to eat, she did so with her back to the wall and her eyes fixed just below eye level, on the edge of the table, where, if she imagined hard enough, her father's bowl might have once rested. She never touched the meat. 14 days, always the same ritual. Accept the tray, nod with thanks, separate the meat from the rest, and place it aside without anger or performance. Just with reverence, as if refusing was not rebellion, but respect. The other girls noticed. At first they teased, lightly, nervously, the way prisoners try to fill silence with something human, but they stopped when they saw she didn't flinch. One girl whispered, "She's mourning." Another shrugged, "She's always like that." But no one dared to ask too deeply. The Americans, though, were less certain. At the edge of the campfire one night, a few guards sat passing a coffee tin filled with watered-down whiskey. They watched the POWs from a distance, their outlines blurred in the dusk. A few of the girls were singing something soft, an old tune they'd probably heard as children. One guard, an older man named Hank, tipped his hat back and asked, "Y'all notice that one girl ain't touched meat once?" Another laughed. "Yeah, the quiet one. I asked around. She only eats beans and bread. Took the ribs off her tray like they were poison. Maybe it's religion," someone offered. "Maybe she's sick. Maybe it's a protest, some kind of quiet defiance." Luke, the youngest, just shook his head. "It ain't politics. She looks at that meat like it hurts her." They fell silent, because none of them wanted to admit what they feared, that the kindness they'd tried to show, blankets, soap, food, might not land the way they intended, that some scars were so deep, even generosity rubbed them raw. Inside her own mind, Midori wasn't protesting. She wasn't defying anyone. She was remembering. Every bite of rice was a ritual. Every spoonful of beans a thread tied to something lost. The meat, especially pork, was different. It wasn't food. It was a phantom. The smell alone summoned ghosts. She saw her father's face every time she smelled it, not the soft version from childhood, but the gaunt one from the day the soldiers came, when he stood still as they loaded his life into crates, his hands at his sides, his mouth set like stone. At the mess table, she sometimes caught herself turning her head as if he might appear beside her, as if the wind might carry his voice, reminding her to chew slower, to swallow completely, to be grateful. But he was gone, and here, in this strange country with its open skies and bottomless plates, her grief took new shape, not as hunger, but as presence. She mourned in silence, not the loud, weeping kind the Americans understood, but the still, precise kind the Japanese revered. She didn't cry, she honored. Each refusal was a gesture of memory, each untouched rib a prayer. When the others laughed at soap bubbles or cowboy songs, she didn't scorn them. She simply could not join. Her mouth didn't know how to make those shapes any more. Her laughter had been buried alongside something she could not name. And so, for 14 days, she ate what wouldn't betray her, what didn't remind her of warm pens and straw, of pigs with names whispered in secret, of a man who taught her how to listen to creatures who could not speak. 14 days of silence. And in that silence, she did not find peace. But she did find a place to keep him. Just beyond the edge of her tray, just outside the reach of fire and smoke. That was where it began again, the scent. Not loud, not sudden, but creeping. It drifted on the warm air like a memory that had learned how to walk. Smoke, fat, fire, the kind that settled in the throat and clung to the back of the tongue long after the meal was over. Midori stood near the edge of the yard, pretending to watch the clouds, when the first curl of it reached her. Her breath caught. Her fingers curled instinctively into her palm. She knew that smell, not from hunger, but from grief. The fire pit was busy that afternoon. A few of the cowboys laughed as they turned slabs of meat with long forks, the grease popping in sharp bursts. Someone had brought out a battered radio. Music floated over the heat, something twangy and unfamiliar, drifting like a ghost through the air. It should have been harmless, but to Midori it was a summons. She turned away from the smoke, but it followed her. It always did. Her mind carried her back to a narrow yard edged with stones, to the sound of her father's sandals on packed earth, to the low grunt of pigs waking in their pen. She could see his hands again, broad, calloused, gentle as he scratched behind a sow's ear. He never rushed them, never struck them. He believed animals remembered kindness. She used to kneel beside him, holding the bucket while he spoke softly to them, as if explaining the world. The day the soldiers came, the air smelled the same, hot, oily, heavy with something final. They had arrived with papers and orders, boots stamping dust into the ground. Her father bowed. He did not argue. He simply listened. The pigs sensed it. They squealed, restless, sensing the shift in their keeper's breath. When the soldiers began loading them, her father stood still, his hands clenched at his sides, eyes fixed on the earth. Later, when the truck was gone and the yard lay empty, he had walked to the pen and sat on the overturned feed bucket. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared at the ground as if something vital had been torn from it. That was the day he stopped humming while he worked, the day the farm went quiet. The memory rose now like heat off the ground. Midori's stomach twisted. She turned away from the grill and walked until the smell faded, until the air cooled. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them together, willing them to be still. But her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought her back to the yard. The sky was the color of ash. Her father stood with his sleeves rolled, hands darkened as if stained by smoke. He was washing them at the basin, again and again, but the soot would not come off. She tried to help him. The water ran black. The harder she scrubbed, the darker it seemed to get. He looked at her then, his eyes tired but kind, and said nothing. He simply held up his hands. When she reached for them, they crumbled into dust. She woke with a gasp, heart racing, hands clenched, tight against her chest. The barn was silent. Moonlight spilled through the slats, silvering the floor. She swung her legs over the cot and stood, unsure where she was. Her hands shook. She could still smell smoke. Not from the grill now, but from memory. She went to the basin by the wall and turned the tap. Water gushed out, cold and clean. She thrust her hands beneath it, rubbing them together fiercely. Again and again. She scrubbed until her skin burned, until her knuckles turned raw. Still, she felt it there. The imagined grease, the phantom residue of a past she couldn't wash away. When the water finally ran clear and her hands were numb, she leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. Her breath came in shallow pulls. The night around her was quiet, but inside her something trembled. She realized then that her refusal was not defiance, it was mourning. Every meal she declined was a vigil. Every untouched piece of meat a small act of remembrance, not rebellion, not hunger, grief. And as she sat there in the dark, hands aching and eyes burning, she understood something else too. The war had taken her father's animals. It had taken his silence, his pride, his way of life. But it had not taken her memory of him. That was hers to keep. The smell of smoke drifted faintly through the open window once more. She closed her eyes, and this time she did not turn away. He had been watching her for days, not with suspicion like some of the older guards, but with something softer. Curiosity, maybe, or understanding. Luke wasn't much older than she was, barely 20, just a farm boy, drafted into something he hadn't quite signed up for. His hands were sun-darkened, his shirt always a little wrinkled, and he had a way of standing like he was afraid of taking up too much space. That afternoon, he found her beneath the pecan tree by the edge of the camp. She sat with her legs tucked under her, fingers slowly threading and unthreading the hem of her dress. The sun filtered through the branches in streaks, laying patches of light across the dry earth. Luke didn't say anything at first. He just walked over, hesitated, then sat a few feet away with his back against the tree. Minutes passed like wind. Quiet, easy. Finally, he spoke. "You don't like barbecue?" She didn't respond. He didn't press. "I mean, that's okay," he said quickly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know not everybody's into it. Some folks back home can't stand the smell. He chuckled, soft and awkward. "Hell, my uncle used to say it reminded him of war rations. Ain't funny, I guess." Still, she said nothing. He took off his hat, set it in his lap, and let out a long breath. "I don't want to bother you, just figured if you ever want to talk. I'm not real good with words, but I can listen." The wind shifted. She looked at him then. Really looked. Not at the uniform, not at the rifle leaning against the fence, but at the boy. The way his shoulders hunched when he was unsure. The way his eyes didn't flinch when they met hers. And something gave way. "My father was pig farmer." Her voice cracked on the last syllable. 4 words, barely louder than a whisper, but it was enough. Luke blinked. Not in surprise, not in confusion. Just once, gently, as if acknowledging a story too big for questions. He didn't ask what happened, didn't ask why that mattered. He just nodded, slow and respectful, then looked out across the fence line where the cattle grazed in the distance, their movements lazy under the sun. They sat like that for a long while. No words, no expectations. Just 2 young people who should have never been enemies, breathing the same air under the same tree, trying to make sense of a world neither of them had asked to inherit. Midori didn't know why she had said it, why those particular words. But as they hung in the air between them, she realized they weren't just explanation. They were offering. A bridge made from memory and grief. Luke reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something folded, an old worn photo. He passed it to her without comment. A small boy stood beside a pig pen, grinning ear to ear. A man with suspenders and a beard rested a hand on his shoulder. Midori's throat tightened. He tapped the photo gently. "Mine, too." She closed her eyes, then opened them. In that moment, the silence changed. It was no longer absence. It was presence. Of what was lost, of what remained, of something that needed no translation. She handed the photo back. He tucked it into his pocket, and for the first time since she had arrived in America, she smiled. Barely, but it was real. Luke smiled back, said nothing more. They just sat there, 2 children of farmers raised on opposite ends of a war, finding in 4 words the shape of something almost like peace. The next morning, the line at the mess hall moved as it always did, slow, half awake, boots shuffling across packed dirt. But something was different. Midori felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, not dramatic, just gentler, as if something had been unknotted. When she reached the front of the line, Luke was waiting. Same apron, same crooked smile, but in his hands he held a tray. Simple, balanced, no ribs, no pork, just beans, bread, and a perfectly sliced peach. He didn't say anything as he handed it to her, but she nodded, and for the first time she met his eyes. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. He nodded back, then turned to the next person in line without a word. She sat at her usual spot, edge of the bench, back straight. The tray was light, but it carried something heavier than meat ever could. Thought, respect, understanding. The others noticed. Girls beside her whispered. One nudged another and tilted her head toward Luke. Midori didn't explain. She didn't need to. Wordless things began to ripple. Later, in the courtyard, one of the older cowboys, Hank, with the slow drawl and sharper eyes, paused as he passed Luke near the fire pit. He looked at the grill, then looked at the mess table where Midori sat quietly, picking at her bread. "You did that?" he asked, voice low. Luke nodded. Hank didn't smile. He didn't slap him on the back. He just lowered his hat, nodded once, and kept walking. Others noticed too, but no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes or muttered behind their hands. The teasing, the curiosity, It all faded, because now, finally, they understood. It was never about the meat. It was never about pickiness or pride or defiance. It was about memory. And some things you don't eat because they're sacred. The small act, an empty spot on a tray, carried more weight than a dozen explanations. It said, "I see you." It said, "I won't force you to forget." And in a camp where language failed more often than not, it turned out silence was the clearest way to speak. That night, the fire crackled like usual, but the songs were softer. One cowboy, usually loud with whiskey, played his harmonica alone, the tune slower than before. Luke sat near the barn with a tin cup and watched the sky darken into ink. When Midori walked past, he tipped his hat. She didn't bow. She just walked a little slower, not out of fear, but something new, something lighter. And in that space between them, no words, no noise, something healing began. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. Enough to turn grief into ritual, memory into offering, and strangers into something like allies, because kindness, when done right, doesn't need to announce itself. It just fills the empty plate. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or even your own family's stories. Thanks for being here. The next morning, Midori asked for paper. It was a small request, barely more than a whisper, but it carried weight. The camp clerk hesitated, surprised, then nodded and handed her a thin stack of lined pages and a stub of pencil worn down from use. She accepted them with both hands, bowing slightly, as she always did. The paper felt strange beneath her fingers, too clean, too white, like something meant for beginnings rather than endings. She sat alone beneath the shade of the same tree where she had spoken to Luke, knees drawn close, pencil resting on her knee. For a long time, she didn't write. She simply held the pencil and listened to the sounds around her, the lowing of cattle, the murmur of voices, the soft scrape of boots against dust. Then, slowly, she began. She wrote her father's name first. It looked different in her own hand after all this time, smaller, fragile, as if writing it might make it disappear. She paused, breath catching in her chest, then continued. She wrote about the farm, about the pigs he had raised with care, about the way he spoke to them as though they understood every word. She wrote about the day the soldiers came and the sound of the truck driving away. She wrote about silence and how heavy it could be. She wrote about the camp, too, about the food that frightened her more than hunger ever had, about the men who looked at her not as an enemy, but as someone who needed to be seen. She did not name Luke, but she described him, the way he waited, the way he listened, the way he offered nothing but understanding. She wrote about the smell of meat on the wind and how it made her hands shake. She wrote that she had not eaten it, not because she was ungrateful, but because memory had teeth. When she finished, the page was full. Her hand ached. Her eyes burned. She folded the paper carefully, then unfolded it again, smoothing the crease as if smoothing a wound. The words felt heavier now, real in a way thoughts never were. She approached the small office where letters were collected for shipment. A translator sat at a table, sorting envelopes, checking names. Midori hesitated. Then she held out the folded paper. "For my mother," she said quietly. The translator looked at her, then at the page, then back again. Something softened in his expression. He nodded and took the letter with care, placing it in the outgoing stack as if it were something fragile. That night, the camp settled into its familiar hush. The wind stirred dust along the fences. A train whistle sounded far away, faint and mournful. Midori lay on her cot, staring up at the ceiling, wondering how many miles her words would travel, wondering if her mother would recognize her handwriting, wondering if the letter would make her cry, or worse, give her hope. Weeks later, on the other side of the ocean, a woman unfolded that same piece of paper with trembling hands. The house around her was quiet, too quiet. The pig pen stood empty behind her, its wood weathered and gray. The yard where her husband once worked lay overgrown, weeds climbing the posts. She had not heard from her daughter in months. Every knock at the door made her heart seize. She read the letter slowly. Each line took effort. Each word landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through her chest. She read about the food, about the camp, about the kindness of strangers, about a girl who had learned to say no without anger. And as she read, tears slid down her face and dropped onto the page, blurring the ink. When she finished, she pressed the paper to her chest and bowed her head. "She lives," she whispered to the empty room. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass where pigs once rooted. The pen stood empty, but in her mind she could see them again, alive, warm, grunting softly. She could see her daughter standing among them, hair pulled back, hands gentle and sure. The war had taken much. It had taken her husband, her animals, her peace. But it had not taken everything, because across an ocean in a land she would never see, her daughter had found a way to speak again. And in that fragile bridge of words, something broken had begun, slowly, painfully, to mend. The heat that day was dry and humming, a breeze tugging dust along the fence line. It was the last barbecue before repatriation, the final gathering before the long train ride east, before the ships, before home, or what was left of it. Midori stood near the long wooden table, sleeves rolled, a clean apron tied over her uniform. The fire crackled nearby, smoke curling into the late afternoon sun. She didn't flinch at the smell anymore. It no longer struck like a blade. It washed over her now like a tide already spent. She moved with purpose, placing plates, ladling beans, setting bread in neat rows. Her movements were quiet but sure. There was no ceremony to it, just rhythm, ritual. Even the older gods, once aloof or wary, nodded to her now as they passed. She returned their nods. She never touched the pork, but no one asked her to. Luke arrived late, dust on his boots, hair wind-blown from a ride out near the cattle line. He walked straight to the serving table and offered a grin. She met his eyes, and for the first time he saw no trace of fear. Not absence of pain, but strength, full and tempered. He held something in his hand, a peach. He didn't speak, just offered it, open-palmed. She took it, turning the fruit slowly, watching how the sunlight danced across its fuzzed skin. Then, without a word, she sat beneath the tree, the one they had shared weeks earlier, and waited. He joined her. They split the peach. Each bite was soft and sweet and heavy with meaning. She chewed slowly, eyes half closed, and thought of her father's fields, of mornings spent scattering feed, of the laughter that used to echo when the pigs squealed, of the night the soldiers came, of the silence after. But today the silence was different, not born of grief, born of choice. When the peach was gone, she wiped her hands on her apron and looked to the horizon. The train would come tomorrow. Her name was on the list. 98 pounds, the medic had said. But she felt heavier than she had in months, grounded, real. In her pocket was a small diary, nothing fancy, just a few pages of neat lines. Her handwriting had grown steadier with each entry. The last page was blank. She would fill it on the boat. Luke stood first. He tipped his hat. Midori stood too. She bowed deeply. He didn't try to speak, didn't try to promise anything, because what they had shared wasn't a thing that needed saving. It had already done its work. The next morning the camp was quiet. As she boarded the truck toward the train, a few of the girls waved. Some clutched small bundles of belongings. Some cried. Midori didn't. Not because she wasn't sad, but because something inside her had settled. She carried nothing but the diary and the coat she had been given. Her hands were empty, but she was not. She looked back once, at the tree, the fire pit, the bunkhouse with the creaking door. Then forward, toward the unknown. Her father's farm was gone. But the memory was not, and neither was she. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.